Zimbabwe cash crisis worse. Talking about Venezuela once again.
Systemic important banks. They removed the 1,000 thing right there called monetary indebtedness. Hey there, hope all is well. Back at you today with some more RT News updates. And as you tell from today's title, How Debt Makes the World Go Round, all focusing on the central banksters, I'm going to share with you some recent articles on how the central banking balance sheet that has grown so large that there's no way in God green's earth that we're going to be able to reduce this 21.7 trillion and counting of funny money that's been created since the last Great Recession. And also want to share with you my thoughts on the quarter-point rate hike as of yesterday from Jerome Powell, the new Federal Reserve chairman, as well as how that decision always impacts the markets as well as other central banks around this globe. But before I dive into those articles, as always, I want to encourage you to tune in tonight for an RTD Live Talk at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. We're going to discuss some of my past news updates as well as this current one here, as well as whatever else is on your mind. But more importantly, before we dive into today's articles, if you're new to RTD, I want to encourage you to click the subscribe button as well as that notification tab to be notified of news updates as well as live talks. And if you have not yet, go to steamit.com/RTD. Follow me there where I share articles throughout the day on matters such as this that I'm not able to do via video. And more importantly, if you're new to RTD altogether, I want to encourage you to visit the RTD University page where I put together all my prior interviews dealing with author, economists, commentators, all sharing their thoughts on monetary policy, fiscal policy, as well as the importance of holding precious metals in your possession today. So let's dive into today's articles. So as I mentioned today, I have several articles dealing with central banksters and their involvement in our monetary system and how in times of trouble, when crises hit, only thing they can do is print to the point where there's 21.7 trillion on their balance sheets of these banks surrounding me here. And so the question would be, how will they begin to unwind their balance sheets? And the answer is they can't, because never before in modern history has there been any monetary policy like the ones that's been implemented. And what concerns me most is after yesterday's Federal Reserve interest rate hike, one thing I know during the conclusion speech that Jerome Powell gave was the idea of the FOMC and their toolkit about them at any point if anything does happen, how they can go back into their toolkits and implement some more policies that will be definite game changers like the ones that we're currently under now, whether it be QE, ZERP, NERP, you name it. All those policies that have been implemented by these gentlemen here is the reason why the cost of living is so high, inflation is through the roof, and it's hard for the middle class as well as the lower class to sustain themselves with their daily cost of living. So before I dive to that, as always, if you find this information informative, give it a thumbs up so more people can come across this information and find out what's going on in our monetary system and how the central bankster debt makes the world go round. But more importantly, share this information with your family and friends via social media so they can also find out about these matters that are very important. And like always, I'm going to just skim through the surface, give you something to think about on top, but more importantly, take time for yourself. Scroll down below, click on the links to the articles that interest you most, and educate yourself on these matters right now. So the very first article here is from CNBC, and it says the market is having a hard time adjusting to a new day at the Fed. So this is the follow-up article from yesterday's Fed meeting where Jerome Powell hiked interest rates a quarter point in the midst of this tightening era that we're currently in. And give an idea what's going on here, it says the new Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, set himself apart from his predecessors in a few meaningful ways. It says his remarks in this first conference indicated central bank weighed more to economic data and less to theoretical analysis. It says stocks gave Powell a cold reception, selling off following Wednesday's Fed decision and continued to drop in Thursday's trading. And so as I read through this article here, one thing that stood out is the idea that typically the Federal Reserve chairman always tend to stick to the script of following their own plots and their own data. But it seems like this one here might do something a little bit different. Because he's a new Fed chairman with somewhat of a mystical background, it's good to say his approach might be different than his predecessors. And so one thing I want to read to you is some things I highlighted here. It says the knee-jerk reaction to the new Fed wasn't good. Thursday saw a market swoon that drops in the market averages approaches 1.5% in morning trade. Said investors flocked to safe haven bonds despite a still pervasive feeling that the Fed will be raising rates aggressively. For years, the Fed had professed to be data dependent. It was basing much of its decisions on models-based analysis that often seemed tone deaf to the reality of the ground. Think, for instance, of the fact when policymakers has indicated a 6.5% unemployment rate will be the basis for a policy tightening, only to watch that level come and go without much action. However, the market was tuned in more to Powell's words. He indicated in a comparatively short 43-minute news conference that he has limited interest in forecasting or central bank verbosity. Says, quoted, the committee made one decision, and that was to raise the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, Powell said. One thing that stood out to me is the fact that he was very blunt in saying that they made one decision, which was to raise rates. So it's good to say that going into the meeting prior to, there was no real discussion as to whether or not they would or they wouldn't. They're going to stick to the script of tightening right now with diminishing their balance sheet of $4+ trillion, as well as their desire to continue to hike the interest rates to somewhat of a normal status, which would not be possible, all in the midst of this so-called economic expansion, as he stated during his conference. And so the idea that they're going to decrease their balance sheets and hike rates in the midst of an economic expansion is very questionable to me, since in my opinion, I believe that we've never fully recovered out of the Great Recession, nevertheless to continue to call it an economic expansion. So we'll see how this tightening and increasing of rates will pan out, but I'm sure in the long run it will not be good for other central banks that's intertwined with the policies of the Federal Reserve Bank, as the EU continues to do QE as well as the Bank of Japan. So it's going to be interesting to see how all these banks continue to try to spin that narrative of an economic expansion or recovery, while in actuality they know that we're in deep trouble. Next article here is from Bloomberg. It says the risk in central bank balance sheets are clear. It says the Fed is virtually unique in regards to the safety of its holdings. Other banks, not so. So here you have a picture of Draghi, Janet Yellen, as well as the Bank of Japan gentleman there. And so one thing that stood out to me was the actual holdings as of now. This is somewhat of an older article, but it says here, global central banks now have 21.7 trillion in assets, and that figure is heading to 24 trillion by next September. It says the combined actions of the world's central banks have never happened before. So how do you characterize normal in that context? You can't. So the idea that there's 21 trillion and the expectation of possibly 3 or 4 more trillion, and we're supposed to be in an economic expansion, how do you justify that? You can't. How can you unwind that? You can't. So as we go further on in these articles, you're going to see how the idea of debt in and of itself is the problem, because all these trillions came out of nowhere and they're just sitting on the balance sheets of these central banks, which are not government entities in and of themselves. They're private institutions designed to stabilize the banking system, nevertheless the people or the public. So more information, if you're interested in reading the article, find it below.
Is the next recession?
Recession will be.
Will be a recession.
We're going to hit a recession.
The date of the next recession?
A U.S.-only recession typically lasts 8 to 10 months, but a lot of things about this particular one have not been typical. So
a crash is coming. Now, whether it's 6 months from now, 12 months, 36 months, no one knows.
I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. If you know what to do, if you have the right plan to set up, you can make a lot of money from this.
Next article here is from Liberty Street's Economics, and I think it's quite interesting because it talks about what central banks tend to do in the midst of crises. And it says, how do central banks' balance sheets change in times of crisis? So I'll highlight a couple of things here I want to share with you to kind of highlight the idea that during a crisis, the only thing these gentlemen around me and the central banks can do is to create funny money or to expand their balance sheet, which is what they're going to do come this next economic downturn when it's officially announced. But it says liabilities composition during the crisis. It says the primary change on the liability side of central banks' balance sheets was a large buildup of reserves available to the banking system. So the idea that their balance sheets were expanded not to really help the public, but to help the banking system. It says during the crisis, central banks typically extend loans to banks and sometimes less traditional counterparties to support financial stability. It says to some extent the increase was necessary, referring to the Great Recession, to accommodate an increase in demand as banks wanted to hold more liquid assets to protect themselves from shocks. So the idea of balance sheet expansion was the idea of keeping the banks liquid in case they ran into some problems. It says after the crisis, some central banks conducted QE or quantitative easing policies to stimulate their economy, for example, by lowering long-term interest rates. The intention was not necessarily to increase the supply of reserves. Nevertheless, asset purchases increased reserves substantially. It says asset composition during the crisis. It says the changes in central bank assets also differ substantially between crisis and the aftermath. So the idea of bringing funny money into existence to stabilize or to stimulate hasn't proven to work out too well. If we're still near 0% interest rates or negative in the EU, and the idea that we're still in an economic expansion with those type of rates. Then it goes on to say what they purchase, and it says, mortgage-backed securities, and so the ECB, corporate bonds and whatnot. And so the idea here is the fact that During crises, these gentlemen around me, the central banksters, all they do is bring debt into existence to help the banks first, to keep the financial markets alive. In the meantime, debasing the money that's already in existence, which is being held by the public in the form of savings and investments and whatnot, solely diluting the purchasing power of the monetary units you hold in your savings and investments. So something worth thinking about, but if you're interested, read more for yourself. Here's another article from Daily Reckoning by Nomi Prinz, and it says, Central Bank Money Rules the World. It's a lengthy article, but quite interesting. I'll share with you a little bit what it's talking about. It says central banks operate in collusion. It says when the Fed signals it's raising rates or markets overreact negatively to threat, another central bank steps in. By colluding, other central banks offer even more dark money, i.e. QE, to keep the party going. It says in an economic pinch, the Bank of Japan will keep dark money flowing. So the first part of it talks about the Bank of Japan. It says that's a clear sign of more manipulation of the bond market, referring to Bank of Japan buying up everything they can. And now we have confirmation that Japan likely has more dark money coming, which means that more QE will be announced from the Bank of Japan. Then it scrolls down a little bit more, talks about the EU with Mr. Mario Draghi. Meanwhile, over in Europe, on February 5th, the ECB president Mario Draghi told a European Parliament hearing in Strasbourg, France, that the ECB can't yet declare victory in the fight to resurrect inflation. Since to calm financial markets, he noted, monetary policy will evolve in a fully data-dependent and time-consistent manner. That means more central bank intervention to bolster markets when they buckle. So more QE and this dark money she's referring to. Says in the UK, with Mr. Mark Carney over my shoulder, says the jobless rate rose for the first time since 2016, and wage growth isn't hitting the Bank of England's 3% target rate. Here are implications that the Bank of England, despite having hinted at tightening, can keep rates where they are given elements of economic weakness still prevail, since more dark money could be coming if economic conditions warrant it. And the very last one here has to do with Federal Reserve Jerome Powell. It says, if the Fed rate hike today teaches us anything, referring to yesterday, is that Jerome Powell will eventually embrace the same unlimited easy money policy, QE, dark money, whatever you want to call it, on any sign of market weakness, while the global web of central banks remain omnipresent as ever. Just the idea here that Nomi Prinz gave a great outline of how the Bank of Japan, ECB, Bank of England, and the Fed are all interconnected, and they make their decisions based upon what they feel is best for the banking system first, based upon how things appear to be and not what they really are. So more information, if you're interested, feel free to read it. The next couple articles I want to share with you, just the titles alone give you an idea what's going on. And if you're interested, read more for yourself. But it says, global debt is the danger. Beware the butterfly moment. Next one here is from centralbanking.com, and it says, Bank of England's FPC sees risk lurking in global debt markets. So once again, risk, debt, markets. Next one here is well worth reading because it's listed as being from EdmondDeRothschild.com. And so everyone knows the Rothschild family, the primary central bank creator of all this funny money. It's a very lengthy article, but very interesting because it talks about debt. And so if you scroll down, it gives you more insight into what's going on. Here it says debt is used to pay down debt. It says when debt is used for productive and value-adding purposes, then the economy does fine. It said it grows and is able to repay what is owed. But if the debt is used to repay other debts, or to fund non-productive projects, then its value diminishes and repayment becomes almost impossible. This is largely what is happening today on a global scale. It says debt is used to pay down debt. It's like a merry-go-round with new players jumping on from time to time, but with nobody jumping off. Contraption just keeps getting bigger and going around faster than anyone could ever guess. We are all so far in debt that every newborn child owes several $1,000s when it takes its first breath. So here we have a couple articles dealing with the monetary system and how debt makes the world go round. And it all starts with the central banks. As we see the Federal Reserve continue to lead the way in quantitative tightening, where they're looking to reduce their balance sheet as well as increase the interest rates, it's going to lead to a monetary fiasco at some point in time because never before has this type of policy been implemented. And as I said earlier on in this news update, what concerns me is the tools that have yet to be unleashed. And if we know based upon history, all the central banks do is inject liquidity directly into the banking system first and then allow the banks to then decide where that money goes. We know that whatever policy that comes next when the official recession is announced, at that point, those tools will be something that will be very catastrophic for holders of national currencies, especially if they happen to go NERP or negative interest rates here in the United States of America, where it will be a flat out theft of your savings as well as your deposits in your savings account. And also it will hurt every financial instrument in the form of pensions, retirement accounts, because those accounts are already suffering receiving very little yield as we speak. And so in the days ahead, central bankers will only make this world go around even faster as they inject more debt and bring more debt into existence just to keep the banking system alive. And along the way, public, those who hold the national currencies, will be the primary victims in this monetary experiment in the days ahead. So other than that, I wanted to share these articles with you. I would love to hear your thoughts. As always, give it a thumbs up if you find this informative. Please share this with your family and friends so they can find out what's happening with this debt making the world go round and how the world might spin even faster come the next announcement of the next recession. The printing presses are cranked up and more central banking policies implemented. So look forward to you joining me tonight at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time for RTD Live Talk. See you later tonight.